Hey, John Morey here, and today I am going to walk through a painting that I did and talk about my process for doing a landscape oil painting. So first I went down to the local hardware store and bought myself a masonite board and cut it down to size. I'm working here at a 7x7 size, so it's going to be a smaller painting. I sanded it down and gessoed it up. Now I'm working on a 1" by 1" grid here so I can accurately transfer the information over. The nice thing I like about landscape paintings as opposed to portraits is you don't have to be exact in proportions because nature isn't exact in landscapes. You can make the rocks different sizes and things like that. Now I'm starting out with the background here with a neutral value, a warmer color, just because colors and values can play tricks on your eyes if you start on a completely white or completely black background, which is why I like to do this and work on a neutral value gray palette as well. So I'm knocking out some of the whites here so that lighter colors in the sky. Starting to shape out the form of the mountains in the background and the stream here as well. Bringing out some of those lighter colors. Starting to block things in, not getting too detailed. I like to go through different phases where I focus on certain things during each phase. And in the beginning phase, I'm not too worried about details. So in the first phase, I'm just blocking in colors and shapes, and not worrying about getting too detailed or accurate because this is all going to be covered up again. But again, colors and values can play tricks on your eyes, so I want to get close. So when I place the colors in the next phase on top of it, it's going to be more accurate and it's not going to play tricks on my eyes. Now the sky is going to be the lightest part of this project, and so that's my starting point with a light value, and everything else is going to get darker from there. I always work from background to foreground. In the background, the colors are always going to be less saturated, and the value contrast is going to be much less. And as I work to the foreground, it becomes more contrast and higher saturated colors. Blocking in this little stream here, going lighter in the background and moving darker to the foreground, and blocking out some of these shapes on the side of the stream. There's a little bit of a cast shadow going from right to left, casting a shadow on the left side of the stream. So those will be a little bit cooler colors as well. As I'm working in this beginning stage, I use a lot of medium to thin out this paint so I can get some of those organic brush strokes in there, revealing a little bit of the underpainting, which will help with textures and give some implied detail. I'm adding a little bit more cool colors on top of this here, the shadow and the mountains. Getting some of those implied shadows in the sagebrush and different plant life there. I'm adding some warmer colors on the face of this mountain in the background. It's going to be one of the highlights of this painting. It will still be in the background and not be as saturated where the sun hits the rocks, but I still want it to be warmer. And this red rock on the side of the river is going to be more of a purple color, even though it's a red rock, because it's going to be in the shadows. Now that it's blocked in, I'm going to go back over the top for my second phase and focus more on the shapes and getting the colors a little bit more accurate while avoiding too much detail. Because if I start, it's always a battle with me, because I always want to get in there and start throwing down detail. But if things aren't exactly right and I have to go back and fix things, it's a much more lengthy process, and psychologically I don't really want to do it if the detail's already in there. So I go back and I start to fix some of these values and colors a little bit and block in some of the shapes, lightening up the sky a little bit, adding a little bit more lighter, cooler colors here in the background mountains. I'm separating some of these very distant mountains from the not so distant mountains with some value, implying that there's some distance there. Putting almost a little bit of haze in between that set of mountains and lightening things up. I'm starting to bring in some of the closer mountains here with some darker values while still not being extremely dark, and warming up just a little bit the colors. I'm adding some highlights here, and these are going to be very, very important. And just a little teeny dot here and there adds a lot in these mountains. Now this closer mountain, it's going to be a little bit darker in value. The sun is off to the right and behind it a bit, so it's going to be mostly cast in shadow with some subtle highlights, rim light, and some subtle highlights on the side. Bringing a little bit of purple into the shadows here of this mountain to separate it a little bit and bring it forward a little bit more, warming up the shadows, warming up the colors of the mountains. Always a struggle for me not to get too detailed in this phase. I'm starting to get a little too detailed here. I want to back off from that a little bit. Just focusing on the major shapes of the subject. It's always funny because there's always an ugly phase to this painting or to paintings, and you just gotta push through it. Push through the ugly phase, trust in the process, block things in, block the shapes in, get your values and colors down, and it'll start looking better. You just gotta trust the process. Adding in a little bit darker colors here, warmer colors, just blocking it in. As I'm doing this, I'm starting to pay attention to some of the edges, making sure there's a good sharp contrast change on those sharper edges. Starting to block in the red rock here on the side of the river with some more darker, warmer purple colors. In the reference image, I'm paying extra attention to values and to warms and cools of the subject material, and just trusting what I observe. I'm going to bring in some of those really dark colors and know that it's all going to fit together as long as I'm observing correctly and understanding how colors interact, and how a dark color next to a dark color is going to look a lot different than a dark color next to a light color, and just understanding the relationships and how they're going to fit together, knowing that I can really push these darks in the foreground and the color saturation as well. I'm really getting excited about getting in here with some detail as I put this together and can see it taking shape, see it coming to life. Now I'm noticing that I need to lighten up and warm up this lower part of the sky next to the mountains, where the sun's coming through more and going off into the distance, into the atmosphere. So I'm outlining these mountains with a warmer color, and thickening it up a little bit. And the clouds here are quite a bit darker This is one of those moments where I trust what I'm seeing, because in your mind you think, oh, clouds are white, right? But in this case, the sun is coming from the right side and the clouds are casting a shadow on the left side. And it's quite a bit darker than the sky. Even darker than what I'm painting right now. I'll have to go back in and fill that in a little bit. And then on the light side, it actually gets on the left side, or on the right side of the cloud, it actually gets a lot lighter than the sky. So it's an interesting play with light. I love the texture of these clouds. It just reminds me of a nice warm summer day, relaxed, not too many clouds, just soft, relaxed. Now I'm bringing in a little bit of those lighter highlights. Clouds. No, I'm not using white, just a lighter, warmer color. And the shadows are a cooler color. They're still warmer than the sky. Have more browns and yellows in there, and reds, but still cooler than the highlights of the clouds. So I'm warming up the highlights of the clouds as the sun hits it, where it's a lot more yellow and ochre colored. So mixing a little bit of value variation in there to give the clouds some personality and depth. I'm going to come back in here and warm up this a little bit to emphasize the change in horizon, change in depth from the mountains in the back. I'm not going too warm with these colors, too saturated, because it is still in the background, but it is a big focal point of the painting, and I want to make that pop a little bit more against the bluer mountains in the background. So I'm going to warm the shadows up a little bit, and then warm up some of these other background mountains a little bit more. To give them a little bit more depth. Pull in a little bit more highlights here on this mountain. And I'm paying attention to not just the reference image, but all of the other surrounding elements and how it all relates together on the painting that I'm painting right now. Making sure that I'm keeping everything in balance. There's a balance to everything. You can go too dark, you can go too light, too saturated, too unsaturated. You just gotta fill it out and make sure that you're at that good balance, and not be afraid to push it one direction or the other if you need to. I'm adding a little bit more detail into this mountain. I'm noticing that it's lighter towards the base of the mountain, and a little bit more saturated in red as it gets to the top, a little bit darker. So it's not just a flat face, giving it a little bit of a gradient in here. And using a little bit thicker paint to bring those brush strokes out to add a little bit of texture. And then down low, it's not quite as light, but there is some highlights on the rocks below. Now I'm going back in and adding a little bit of a cooler and lighter color in places to give it some texture in the shadows. These kind of rocks are not smooth, and so I'm just going in and adding variations of light and dark and cool and warm in there just slightly. I'm going to darken this mountain up in the foreground here and add a little more warmth to it. As it is a little bit closer. What I like about this shadow right here is it implies that there's a bigger mountain or a bigger hill to the right that's casting this shadow, which gives the painting again a little bit more depth. So you can imagine what's out there, some kind of bigger mountain casting a big shadow here. Still not going too dark on this. I don't want to make it a black shadow. I want to just still keep it light because it is in the background. So I want to have that atmospheric feeling to it. And then contrast that with the the lit ground behind it. Now all this sagebrush in the background, it provides some interesting textures with some pretty dark colors and some pretty light colors. Not too much contrast in the background, but as it gets to the foreground, there's a bit more contrast. We get really dark, rich colors on the bottom where the branches of the sagebrush are, and as it goes to the top, it gets pretty light and saturated with color. I'm going to shape this stream a little bit. So it has a little bit more personality. It's not just a straight line. Kind of weaves in and out here. And up against the bank on the left side, we've got that cast shadow from the right side of the bank. As I'm going through this painting, like I said, I want to make sure that the relationships between everything else are accurate, and so I try not to focus on one area too much and add too much detail to one area. And so I go over it and don't finish it completely in one area. I go back and forth and continually bring little elements in here and there in different parts of the painting, so I can see how it's coming together and if everything fits and if I need to make any adjustments. And I like how this is coming together, how I can feel the warmth of the sun coming in on this. I'm starting to feel that. See it come together, which is a cool feeling. I'm gonna bring in some of the darker, warmer purple shadows here of this rock that I'm gonna paint in here, on the right side, and it's a lot more orange and red and warmer saturated color here, so I'm going to separate that a little bit from the other more greenish sagebrush next to it. I'm just using a flat paintbrush here to paint all this in. I try to vary my paintbrushes depending on the object and depending on the type of brush stroke I want. Okay, that's starting to take shape a little bit. Separate itself out so you can tell start to tell it's a rock and not sagebrush. I really like that warm rock that's being hit by the sun, the red rock, and then contrast that with the rock in the shadow on the right side of the painting next to the stream. I think that's going to be a cool little contrast. I'm going in and adding a little bit more spot highlights, and as the brighter the highlights get, the less I try to add. I don't do big brush strokes for higher, lighter highlights, because typically blow it out pretty quick. I want to avoid really light lights and avoid really dark darks until the very end, and then it's just very subtle, small areas where I do that. Because if I end up doing it too quickly and really push those lights, then I don't have a lot to work with. I don't have a lot of room for error in creating focal points. So I want to push those values back just a little bit and avoid really making them light until the very end. Bringing in some darker colors here in the foreground. I really want to make this a focal point here, this bend in the river, so I'm going to make this fairly dark, and then the sagebrush above I'll make lighter. And add some highlights there with the sun hitting it. Warm up some of this rock to make that clear that that's some more of that red rock, and a cast shadow on that side of the bank. And blend it up into the highlights from the sun. For the sagebrush, I'm using an old brush that I have, an old paintbrush that has a lot of frayed bristles, and that gives me some nice brush textures. I'm creating this sagebrush in Plant Life. As I get more in the background, I use a cleaner brush. I'm darkening up some of this foreground water, making sure that it's really in the shadows. And on the left side of the water, noticing it's a lot more blue, and as it goes right, it gets a little bit more red as some of that sand underneath the water starts showing through a little bit. On the left side, it's more reflected by the sky. On the right side, it gets a little bit more purple as the sand, you can see the sand underneath. But it is all very dark still. Now, I'm noticing as it gets in the background, there's a little bit more disturbed water that's not necessarily rapid, but it's just maybe the wind hitting it, and it's breaking up the reflection of the sky, so it's a little bit more gray, and then the calmer water I can see is reflecting that sky a little bit better, and it's more blue. Darken up this red rock here in the shadows. And add a little bit of a hint of this cooler plant life in the shadow too. Adding some implied detail in shadows can add a lot to a painting rather than just having a solid color. Just some little hints of things going on in shadows. And a little bit of a reflection of that mountain in the background coming through in that water. Some highlights from the sagebrush in the water too. Around the banks of this, these rocks coming up in the middle of the water, it's a little bit lighter where the water comes close to it. And I'm going to start painting in a little bit of these rapids here that are a little bit more purple. Just a hint of those coming through. And I feel like those are going to be a bit of a challenge. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that yet. In the foreground here, on top of the rocks, I'm going to add a little bit of darker shadows. One thing I did notice is like to soften up some of these lines between lights and darks, and as the light hits the sagebrush. It's a little bit too sharp of a change. Just soften it up a little bit and bring some transition. Alright, now it's time to tackle this landmass in the middle of the water, and to do that I'm going to use a couple different brushes. I'm going to use my angled brush here to get some of the form a little bit. Then I'm going to come back in with my brush that is old with fraying bristles, and I'm gonna get load it up with paint, and then just start dabbing it a little bit, bringing in some of that texture with rocks, with the highlights for rocks. And it's a warmer reddish color, so bringing some of those rocks in. So I'll start with some of these not quite as high of contrast to bring some texture, and then I'll come back in with a little bit lighter colors and variation. Start getting some of that rock texture in there. It's still looking pretty flat right now, so I'm going to have to come back in, add a little bit darker colors towards the bottom where it's curving down into the water. So bring some of that dark colors back in there in the base. Adding a little bit more light. It's all about relationships, so trying to judge between dark and light and how everything's related together. So I think I'm gonna, rather than adding too much dark, I'm gonna bring in some more light colors. And even in the shadows I can see some light rocks coming through. And then some of these light areas I'm going to come back in with a dark shadow to cast shadow on some of these bigger rocks. Give the rocks some form to imply that there's that rocky texture. I think I even need to darken this up even more. And then add a little bit lighter color here to contrast that. A bit more purple. Water is a very interesting thing because it's very, towards the back here, it's very glass-like. If you look at it in nature, it's very smooth. But there's a lot of simple, subtleties in water to make it look that way. It's not just a flat color. You can see other things coming through. You can see a little bit of the ripples on the ripples in the water. So I'm trying to capture that with subtle variations. And even in the dark areas, there's some really quite light rocks in there that I want to bring out. It's not going to be as light as some of the other rocks in the foreground, but they're still very light. Adding some more shadows on those rocks. Alright, time for the bottom mass here, land. Let's add some dark and then bring those highlights in. A little bit more implied. Now I'm going to go in here and start adding some of this under the water detail. Subtle variations. It's a lot warmer coming through. And there's darker purple areas as the water, or as the land underneath the water goes away from the surface of the water, it gets darker and more purple. And as it's closer to the surface under the water, it's more red. You can see that red sand coming through. Not going to get too detailed, just some implied detail. And I'm adding in a lot more red in the center of these two masses because so there's not such a sharp drop. It doesn't look like it's just floating on the water, but it looks like the land is sinking into the water. Time to bring in some more ripples. And I'm trying not to go too light on these. Just starting darker and working lighter. That's always been better for me if I don't try and bring the highlights in. At the very end is when the highlights come. Just shaping some of these ripples in the water as it hits shallower ground. And I'm not loving it now, but I'm just trusting the process, working through it. And I know it's going to be I'm going to have to be very accurate with these values because the shadows, because it's such in this area, there's a lot of value change. But I can't make it too dark and I can't make it too light, otherwise it's not going to look like ripples. So I got to get it just right. Make it dark enough, but not too dark in the shadows. And so what those ripples are doing is reflecting, or some of those ripples are reflecting that sagebrush, the shadows in the sagebrush, and so it can't be darker than the sagebrush. It's got to be close. some lighter color now. It does get pretty light, but it never gets lighter than the sky, or this, unless there's some very small highlight ripples, maybe that. But even then, I don't think I'm gonna make it that bright, that light. So I'm just trying to compare surrounding areas and think about what's really happening with the light reflections, what it's reflecting. And I can't make it lighter than that. Otherwise it's going to look unrealistic. Some more ripples here. Now this area right here that's running over some pebbles and some rocks. It's breaking up the water and adding some dark little ripples here. And they're pretty dark, so I'm gonna make those shadows darker. And I'm not liking what the ripples are doing, so I'm going to switch where I'm working and work more on this land here. Bring some of those highlighted rocks in with my frayed brush. And my detailed brush bringing in some bigger rocks. I need to add a little bit more highlights on some of these other rocks too. Bring them out just a bit. Just a little bit, not a ton of them. Just every once in a while there's a rock that's catching some highlight that's making it very light. This land that's closer to us, it is quite a bit darker than the others, so I'm making sure to make it darker there. And then as it's fading into the water, you can see some of those rocks coming through. I'm transitioning here to the red rock and making some of it come through as it fades into the sagebrush. I'm not liking the hues and the values here, so I'm going to add a little bit more browns in here to highlight some of that sand on the rocks. Getting some good variation in hue to make it look a little bit more rocky, not so flat. Some more of those red shadows in the cracks and crevices of the rocks. And a lot of it isn't deep crevices, it's just more waves and some sand in there. So it's not too dark in value. So I'm going to keep that still fairly light comparatively. Little teeny emphasis on dark areas. bring out some of these highlights on these closer brush, or on these closer sagebrush areas. I'm using a lot of yellow and white and red colors. And then blending those into the shadows of the sagebrush. Again, using that smaller frayed brush to get that texture in there. And fading it down into the dark areas. Now this area needs to be a little darker, so I'm going to add some shadow there. And some variation in the color and the hue to show the change in the different kinds of plant life in sagebrush, and what other kind of plants are in there, I don't know, but bring some of that highlight into the water. Now I'm not liking these highlights in the water, so I'm going to come back and add a little bit more blue in there. I think they're too yellow. The hue's a little on the highlights. There's this little puddle inside that I like that I'm going to add to that. A little puddle where when the water was higher, it was running through and left a little bit of water there. And this is one example of why I don't like to get too detailed at first, because I don't like these ripples. So I'm going to come back and fix them, go over the top. And I don't like how there's continuous rapids, so I want to make some of that water smooth, some of that water rapids. So there's breaks, so there's time to rest, so your eyes aren't looking at a line of rapids. I'm going to calm some of those rapids down. Go back over the top. And if this was all detailed, psychologically, I would have a hard time going in and fixing it and changing it. But because I didn't spend too much time on it, in my mind, it's easier to go back and go over the top and fix it up. So that's what I'm ending up doing. Calming some of these rapids down a little bit. And one of the problems I can already see is that hue is just not right. The value might be right, but I think that in the highlights, they're a little bit too warm, and I need to cool it down with some blue. Switch it up to these. I want to blend this a little bit better on this. This is an important composition. It's a highlight or a focal point, so I want to focus on this a little bit. Make sure it's a good transition here from the sunlight into the shadow. A little bit of detailed sagebrush branches. Add a little bit of shadow to this where I put the water in here, so you can see where where the curvature happens into that water. Alright, adding a little bit more of that blue hue in there. I really noticed that I've got to darken this foreground area on the left side up quite a bit as it transitions from the shadow, from the cast shadow of the opposite bank to the highlighted, the sun coming over, peeking over that. It's gonna be a little bit darker. Okay, better. This is a bit of a challenge for me. I've never worked on a painting that's this small, a landscape painting that's this small, and it's really forcing me to think about how to be detailed without being too detailed. To have implied detail using brush strokes and value and highlight and mostly value, to really imply that detail and not get in there with my really fine brush, but just to give the idea of a detailed landscape. I'm going to change these ripples up a little bit. They're a bit too close together, so I'm going to spread them out a little bit and make it a little bit calmer, and not such a highlight, but more of a subtlety. So we're gonna make just calming some of this water down, so it's not just a continuous, rapid. I'm feeling much better about this. I feel like I can make this work. Getting close to finishing this off, which is always a fun feeling. And it's always a struggle because there's always something to fix, right? There's always something that's not quite right. Always something that but you've gotta just choose when to be done and move on. Nitpick at it all day long, but there's a point of diminishing returns where it looks good enough. Just more subtle waves, subtleties in here, dark and light, softening it up a little bit. Go back in and fix this hue, make it cooler, so it's not so yellow. Cool it up a little bit. I like this subtle, at the tip of this bank here, I like this subtle change from that blue to a grayer blue, implying some wind hitting that water, some subtle ripples. All right, I'm gonna wrap this painting up, call it done. And I had a great time doing this. I've learned a lot as I worked on the smaller size, and I appreciate everybody for hanging around, and I hope you learned a little bit too. So feel free to leave your thoughts, and I'd love to see what you've been working on. So please share some of your landscape paintings and what you're working on. I'd love to see it. Thanks for watching.